Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers. I'm Jim Papandrea. This podcast is a production of Catholic Culture. Sign up for our newsletter at catholicculture.org/newsletter. Today we continue our series on the Doctors of the Church with our second episode on St. Thomas Aquinas. As I mentioned in the last episode, it would be impossible to do justice to the legacy of Aquinas in a podcast. And very much like St. Augustine, Aquinas' work spans a vast scope of time and topics, so that it's impossible to boil him down into easy-to-digest themes. And even if you could do that, again, like Augustine, you would have to talk about the early Aquinas and the later Aquinas, because he modified his own thought over time. So today I'm going to cover a few specific themes which emerge for me as some of the most significant. No doubt, listeners who know Aquinas well will have their own primary themes, but for what it's worth, here are my thoughts. St. Thomas wrote, "If anyone wants to write back against what I have said, I shall be delighted, because there is no better way of disclosing truth and confuting error than by arguing with people who disagree with you." On another occasion, he wrote, "If anyone, puffing himself up with bogus knowledge, dares to argue against what I have written, let him not hold forth in corners or in the presence of lads who are incapable of judging such a difficult subject, but let him write against this book if he dares. You will then have to deal not just with me, who am the least in this affair, but also with a crowd of other lovers of truth, who know how to resist your errors and remedy your ignorance." Truth be told, though, sometimes there was no crowd, and sometimes it might have seemed like it was St. Thomas against the world. And there was at least one occasion when it came time to defend Thomas, no one took his side. But he stands in that great tradition, perhaps the greatest of that tradition, of apologists and debaters who believe that even the toughest questions cannot threaten the Christian faith. And even one's opponents can be a gift from God if it means sharpening one's own arguments and clarifying one's explanations. As I always tell my students, the truth is found along that royal road of the middle way between the extremes. Or another way to think about that is that the truth is in that beautiful Catholic both and, which refuses to sacrifice one truth for the sake of another, or just to avoid a paradox. And St. Thomas Aquinas is the one who finally and definitively articulated that balance of the middle way between Augustine and Pelagius, and between Anselm and the likes of Peter Abelard. And in the debates of his own time, he navigated the narrow path between a hyper-Augustinianism, which would eventually lead to Calvinism, and a pagan Aristotelianism. It's usually stated that the scholastics in general, and Aquinas in particular, got Aristotle from the Jewish and Muslim scholars who had translated Aristotle and reintroduced his work in Europe. That's true to a certain extent. But Albert the Great, and even more so Thomas Aquinas, did already know Aristotle from Christian sources. One source was a Master Peter of Ireland, who was one of Aquinas' teachers at Naples. So even before Aquinas met his mentor, Albert the Great, he was already studying Aristotle. And that set him up to have an even better understanding of Aristotle than his teacher, St. Albert. On the other hand, people also usually assume the scholastics were reading Augustine, but for the most part, they were only reading Augustine in compilations of excerpts, often taken out of context, or they were reading what Peter Lombard said Augustine said, some of which was not even really by Augustine, but only attributed to him. Aquinas seems to have been the first of the scholastics to really read whole books by Augustine, but even then, only later in his career. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest that St. Thomas was the one who rediscovered the major works of Augustine in their entirety while he was working in Rome. When St. Thomas did study under Albert, he transcribed his mentor's lectures, some of which we still have in Thomas's own handwriting, though it's generally agreed to be near illegible. And it's said that the first person to really make a study of Aquinas's autograph manuscripts lost his vision doing it. So what books of his own did Thomas Aquinas write? Well, like our other doctors and scholastics, Aquinas wrote a commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, and he wrote and preached sermons in Latin and Italian. And although he didn't write a lot of poetry or hymns so as to be thought of as a songwriter like some of the others, he did write a few of the most famous Latin hymns we have, including the famous prayer hymn Adoro Te. And when Pope Urban IV instituted the feast of Corpus Christi in the year 1264, and this may have been at the request of St. Thomas himself, the Pope asked Thomas to write a set of Eucharistic hymns for the feast. And Thomas wrote Verbum Supernum and Pange Lingua, which contained the famous O Salutaris and Tantum Ergo. But it seems that the Pope also asked St. Bonaventure to write some hymns. And according to one story, when St. Bonaventure read St. Thomas's hymns, he tore up his own. The rest of Thomas's output is vast. He's another one of our doctors for whom it's difficult to find a complete list of everything he wrote. Though in his case, you can find his complete works which still survive, even online, and I'll include a link to that in the description. So for now, I'll just highlight a cross-section of the kinds of things he wrote and point out what are generally considered the most important. St. Thomas wrote philosophical commentaries, including commentaries on Pseudo-Dionysius's divine names and on Boethius, and of course, multiple commentaries on Aristotle. One in particular is called On Being and Essence, and it's meant to propose common ground between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. The main theological point is that, unlike creatures, God's being is God's essence, or God's substance. In other words, you cannot separate, even conceptually, God's divine substance from his very existence, because unlike everything else in the universe, he is eternal and uncreated. Christians, Jews, and Muslims should agree on this point. And this is important because there was a debate going on at this time among philosophers about whether the matter of the world was eternal. And although some at the time misunderstood Aquinas' take on this, he said, no, only God is eternal because only God is uncreated. His first attempt at a systematic theology was called Concerning Truth, but of course this would be surpassed by his more famous Summa. In the midst of the controversy with the secular clergy, he wrote A Defense of the Mendicant Orders, actually called Against Those Who Criticize. The issue was that the secular clergy, the ones we might call diocesan clergy, did not want the friars to be able to preach, teach, and hear confessions. They thought all of that was their job. Now, to be clear, I assume that means that only those friars who were themselves ordained priests were hearing confessions, not the lay friars. But perhaps an even greater source of frustration for the secular clergy was that the friars answered directly to the hierarchy in their orders and then to the Pope, so that they were not under the authority of local bishops. And also, some people were arguing that if they are monastics, they should do manual labor and should be self-sufficient like the monks. But it was the way of the mendicants that they lived off of alms. So, to the outsiders, they seemed to have the best of both worlds, living in towns and yet not having to do manual work to support themselves, and some were jealous. And there were a few who questioned the very concept of vows of voluntary poverty. In modern terms, it would be like asking whether voluntary poverty was a slap in the face to those who were involuntarily poor? And do the alms given to mendicants take food out of the mouths of the poor? And then there were the spirituals among the Franciscans who were saying that poverty should be absolute. They believed the friars should not own anything, not even books. And so even among the friars, they got distracted by big debates about small questions, like whether the apostles owned anything. But Thomas answers all these questions beautifully. He wrote something called On Perfection. The monastic vows are the means to perfection. He says that poverty is not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end, and so it can be practiced differently according to different callings. He wrote commentaries on biblical books, including Job, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Colossians, and Hebrews. Unfortunately, not all of this survives, though some of it survives in the notes of his students. Just like he wrote down the lectures of St. Albert, his students wrote down his lectures, which were then published as books. And it seems that often Thomas would be working on some larger theme, and when he got to a certain point where he felt background work was necessary, he went ahead and wrote a whole book on the background topic, or on the biblical book that he thought was relevant. His most famous commentary is the Catena Aurea, the Golden Chain, which is a commentary on the Gospels, including quotes from the Church Fathers on each passage. It's an amazing resource, a whole encyclopedic patristic commentary on the Gospels, and it is included in the online works, so check out that link in the description. It even has the Latin and English side by side. St. Thomas wrote an exposition on the Hail Mary, which includes the doctrines of the Assumption, Our Lady's perpetual virginity, and her title of Queen of Heaven. One of his most famous works is the Summa contra Gentiles, or the Summary Against the Nations, nations meaning heathen, of course. And it's been called a kind of textbook for missionaries. Its full title is The Truth of the Catholic Faith Against the Errors of Unbelievers, and it's primarily an apologetic against Islam. The book went through a lot of revisions, which is obvious because we have manuscripts of it in his own handwriting, with the corrections. It's written in 4 books. The first 3 are meant to appeal to a non-Christian audience, so he only gets around to relying on the authority of Scripture in Book 4. The point is that the apologist has to argue for the faith with those who won't necessarily accept the authority of the Scriptures, until you show them in their own terms the truth of the faith, and then you can show them how it's all in the Christian Scriptures. He also wrote Against the Errors of the Greeks, to help bring the East back to Rome. Of course, that didn't have a great effect, but it allows us to see how there was still great interest in reuniting the East and West, even a couple of centuries after the schism. Well, and finally, at some point, he became unsatisfied with lecturing on the sentences of Peter Lombard, and he wanted to start from scratch with his own syllabus for theology. And so he began the famous Summa Theologiae, sometimes called the Summa Theologica, or Summary of Theology, which one might describe as a systematic theology meets catechism meets encyclopedia. There were 20 volumes, and yet he never actually finished it. Believe it or not, it's written to be the text for the intro course for beginners. And here, St. Thomas included something new. Rather than simply quoting the authorities and dogmatically pronouncing the truth, he also talks about his methodology and outlines the philosophical foundations of what he's doing. For example, he talks about epistemology, how it is that people know things in the first place. And of course, he doesn't simply tell you what to believe. Before he tells you what he thinks, he outlines all the arguments against his teachings and explains why they're unsatisfying as answers to the questions. And true to his method, it was while he was working on the Summa that he wrote many of his topical works as background books on disputed questions of the time. For example, on truth, on power, on virtue, on evil, and on the soul. Like St. Anselm of Canterbury before him, Aquinas was committed to the idea that faith and reason are not in competition. But it could be argued that, unlike St. Anselm, Aquinas had a more realistic view of human reason. That is, you can't really figure out everything about God from reason alone, since reason is limited and fallen. And you especially would not be able to come up with the doctrine of the Trinity using reason alone. Using reason, you can know that God exists, but to know that God is Trinity, for that you need revelation. St. Thomas believed that reason alone would only get you so far. It could not bring you to complete faith. Reason was the road to knowledge, but faith is the road to truth. In other words, you can't really just start with reason or philosophy. You start with revelation, and then reason helps you interpret it, and philosophy helps you teach it. It's like St. Anselm of Canterbury was trying to prove, almost on a dare, that you could get to the truths of the Christian faith through philosophy alone. But St. Thomas would say, no, you have to take revealed truth as your starting point, but then you can explain it to unbelievers using philosophy. So for St. Thomas, philosophy is a tool of apologetics. And in this, St. Thomas is much closer to coming full circle to what the early Christian philosopher apologists like Justin Martyr were doing. And like Anselm before him, Aquinas is greatly indebted to St. Augustine. But unlike Anselm, Aquinas found a more permanently viable balance of an Augustinian emphasis on grace with a renewed optimism about the human contribution to one's own salvation. It's a bit of a paradox, the way that St. Anselm was optimistic about human reason, but more pessimistic about our free will, and then Aquinas is the opposite, less optimistic about the power of human reason without revelation, but more optimistic about human participation with divine grace. Another way to say this is that St. Thomas Aquinas finally clarified the Church's teachings in a way that was consistent with the conclusions of the Council of Orange in 529 AD. That was the council that had eventually settled the Pelagian controversy 99 years after Augustine's death. And in the canons of that council, those aspects of St. Augustine's thought where he had gone a bit too far in his arguments against the Pelagians, these were implicitly corrected, without actually mentioning Augustine by name. And the point is that St. Thomas Aquinas was the only person who could really correct the potential problems in St. Augustine and nuance the doctrine of the atonement to bring the Church's teaching to full development. The way I usually explain this to my students is this. St. Anselm had leaned heavily on Augustine and emphasized divine grace as the operative element in salvation. In other words, for him, it's all about divine intervention. But he did it in a way that allowed later Protestants, who were, by the way, intentionally rejecting Thomas Aquinas, allowed them to come up with a version of hyper-Augustinianism that led to Calvinism. Now later, Peter Abelard, not a saint and noticeably absent from the list of doctors of the Church, he reacted against St. Anselm and leaned too hard in the other direction, toward the Pelagian side, making it all about human effort. In fact, he seemed to be saying that a person's intentions, not actions, are the primary criterion for whether something is morally good or evil. Well, Thomas Aquinas took intentionality seriously, but Aquinas found the balance, that synergy of grace and human effort as a response to grace. For those keeping score, this is what we call the semi-Augustinian point of view, and it is consistent with the conclusions of that Council of Orange in 529 AD. It's the middle way between Augustine, who sometimes went a bit too far, and Pelagianism, which definitely went too far in the other direction. For the medieval era, St. Thomas articulated the middle way between St. Anselm and Peter Abelard, and clarified the Church's teaching on how salvation works in terms of the interplay between God's grace and human free will. For Anselm of Canterbury, The atonement was all about divine intervention in the incarnation. The only human element is the human nature of Jesus Christ, which represents the rest of us as one of us. He pays our debt as one of us. For Peter Abelard, the atonement was all about the merit of human intention. If you have good intentions, that's all that really matters. And though Abelard was no Arian, the danger of this is that it can end up in the same place as Arianism, where Jesus Christ is demoted from a savior to just a good example to follow. And I would say that the heretic Peter Abelard is the unofficial patron of a lot of liberal mainline Protestantism. But St. Thomas Aquinas came along and basically said that they are both partly right, as long as each one corrects the other. Anselm is right about salvation being all about the initiative of divine intervention. But if you leave it at that, where is the participation of the person who, in St. Paul's words, works out his salvation with fear and trembling? And Peter Abelard was right about individual participation, as long as you don't assume that we can do anything good without grace. The atonement requires both divine intervention and our participation. St. Thomas Aquinas was able to bring divine grace and free will together in a way no one before him had done, partly because of his concept of secondary causes. God working through grace is always the primary cause of our salvation, but God truly does let us participate in our salvation as a secondary cause. Now, without going too deep into this, you can think of it in the context of prayer. If one were to ask, does prayer really do anything? Why bother praying? If God is in charge, and if it all comes down to God's will, why pray? Well, St. Thomas would say prayer absolutely does work, not because it coerces God into doing our will, but because God allows us to participate in what He is doing as a secondary cause. God is the primary or necessary cause, but we can, so to speak, make things happen with our prayers as secondary causes. And so we really do have free will, we really can participate in grace, and prayer really does work. Another great theme of Aquinas is his emphasis on natural law, as that part of God's eternal law which we can know from reason alone. In other words, even the person who never read the Bible knows enough from observing nature to be responsible for a morality that is consistent with nature. To be moral is to go along with nature and not to oppose God's created order. This also means you can't be free from moral responsibility simply by rejecting Scripture and Christianity. And what this does is it allows Aquinas to articulate an ethical methodology which is not simply based on memorized answers from the Bible, but it's meant to facilitate a formation of character and discernment, so a person should be able to answer questions not asked in the Scriptures. Aquinas does rely on Aristotle for some of this, but he basically created the methodology for clarifying things like St. Augustine's just war theory. And he laid the foundation for Catholic social teaching as it's applied to human rights. Another important clarification St. Thomas gives us is that of essence versus accidents. And this is important for describing God himself in his divine attributes, that is, for clarifying things like divine immutability, that God doesn't change. But I want to emphasize how important this is for clarifying the Catholic understanding of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The essence or substance of anything, including divinity, is that which, if it changed, would make the thing something else other than what it is. And so God doesn't change, because if the essence of God changed, he would cease to be God, so God is unchanging. But in the Eucharist, it is precisely the essence or the substance of bread and wine that do change and become the essence of the body and blood of the Lord, while the accidents, those tangible aspects of the materiality of bread and wine, these do not change, which is why the consecrated sacrament still looks and feels and tastes like bread and wine. Before the consecration, the bread and wine are signs which point to the body and blood. But the sacrament itself is a miracle in which the very essence of the bread and wine become the signs to which they formerly pointed. And so, Thomas brings to a conclusion the debates about the Eucharist which had been going on since the 9th century. The great works of Radbertus and Lanfranc come together in Thomas in a way that sets the stage for the Council of Trent. And he even anticipates the alternative views which will come up among the Protestants, and he proactively refutes them. At the Council of Trent, the bishops there put a few things on the altar to inspire them. One thing was the Bible, and next to the Bible was the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, in spite of all of this, there were some who criticized St. Thomas's teaching, both during his life and after. Much of it had to do with the accusation that Thomas was becoming too much of an Aristotelian. Thomas insisted the problem was not with Aristotle, but with the Muslim interpretations of Aristotle, which apparently tended toward pantheism. But Thomas thought that to reject Aristotle was to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In any case, that made him suspect in the eyes of some, and as you already know, a few years after his death, his teachings were condemned along with those of some of his colleagues who were radical Aristotelians. And this was when St. Albert the Great spoke up for him. In fact, most, though not all, of the Dominicans rallied to Thomas's side, defending him as orthodox. In the end, there was still the kind of distrust of philosophy that we saw all the way back in Irenaeus and Tertullian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Remember, it was Tertullian who famously said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" In other words, what does philosophy have to do with theology? Well, here's how St. Thomas would answer that question. This is from the Summa contra Gentiles. For there are some truths about God which quite exceed the capacity of human reason. For example, that God is three and one. But there are others to which even natural reason can attain. For example, that God exists and that he is one, and others like them, which in fact philosophers have demonstratively proved about God, led on by the light of natural reason. So, philosophy is that which anyone can know about God from observation and from reason, what Aquinas called the preambles to faith. And theology is that which requires revelation to know, what Aquinas called the mysteries of faith. In some places, he writes as though philosophy is a subset of theology, and in other places, it sounds like theology is a subset of philosophy. But for all practical purposes, philosophy is how you explain theology to an unbeliever. And for those who refuse to believe, philosophy is why refusing to believe doesn't let them off the hook for the expectations of moral behavior. Still, even St. Bonaventure himself had criticized what he saw as too much reliance on Aristotle in the non-Christian philosophers, and even in some of their colleagues in the university. And so, even the Franciscans would sometimes criticize the Dominicans, and so each of the mendicant orders often had to fight a war on two fronts, against their critics among the secular clergy and against each other. Eventually, the Franciscans used Thomas's Summa, but restricted it to the professors. Imagine a textbook the students are not allowed to read on their own. The Dominicans responded by forbidding anyone from speaking against Thomas's writings, even though it was understood that they might not agree with everything. But by the year 1285, 11 years after his death, Thomas was vindicated in Paris. And within a year after that, the Dominicans said to their friars, "Not only are you not allowed to disrespect Thomas, you must do everything in your power to promote his teachings." Dante put both Thomas and Bonaventure in paradise, with Bonaventure praising Thomas. And in the year 1309, Thomism became the official teaching of the Dominicans. All Dominicans had to get what would be the equivalent of a college degree in Aquinas if they wanted to go on to study to be a professor. And in 1325, 2 years after Aquinas was canonized as a saint, the Bishop of Paris finally officially dropped the accusations against him. And so it would be that in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Summa of St. Thomas replaced Peter Lombard's sentences as the primary text in the universities. And after that, professors were writing commentaries on Thomas. But then it seems that over time, Thomas fell back into obscurity, which is why we can talk about a Thomist revival in the modern era. In the 19th century, in the face of modernist relativism and anti-Christian political philosophies, Pope Leo XIII endorsed Thomism as the antidote to all these problems and made Thomism the official theology of Catholicism. He wrote, "Among the scholastic doctors, the chief and master of all towers Thomas Aquinas." He also wrote that his fellow bishops should, quote, "restore the golden wisdom of St. Thomas and spread it far and wide for the defense and beauty of the Catholic faith, for the good of society, and for the advantage of all the sciences." He said that Thomas both summarized and, when necessary, corrected everything that came before him. And in the early 20th century, Pope Pius X again promoted Thomism as a non-negotiable articulation of the Catholic faith. And then Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical on St. Thomas, Studiorum Ducem, confirmed that St. Thomas should be the standard for teaching in universities and seminaries. And finally, in Pope St. John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, Thomas's teaching is once again held up as the way to preserve and affirm the reality of absolute truth against relativism. And I've put the links to the relevant papal encyclicals in the description in case you want to read them for yourself. One other thing is worth mentioning at this point. The time of Saints Anthony and Albert and Saints Bonaventure and Thomas was a time when Europe saw the emergence of a new heresy, or what was really a new version of an old heresy. They were called the Cathars, and they were basically medieval Gnostics. They were a kind of resurfacing of the same dualistic heresy that the Church Fathers refuted in the Docetics and Gnostics, and which St. Augustine had refuted in the Manichees. They believed that the creator of this world was a different, evil God, and that consequently everything of the material world, including the human body, was essentially evil. Well, Thomas opposed the Cathars, often by writing as though he was writing against the Manichees. For example, he emphasized that evil is not part of God's good creation, and there is no equal and opposite God opposing the Christian God. And Thomas opposed their dualism of body and soul by affirming, as the Church Fathers had done, that a human person is an embodied soul, not a soul trapped in a body which is meant to be discarded, but rather a body and soul which are meant to be reunited in the resurrection, and that the incarnation of Jesus Christ itself proves that God is not opposed to the physical world, and that God does, in fact, mediate grace through material things. As one who called out and corrected error and heresy, St. Thomas embodies the best of the Dominican spirit of educating and teaching truth. In fact, maybe you know this, but I love how some people take the Latin word Dominicani, meaning Dominicans, and split it up into two words, Domini Cani, the Lord's dogs, meaning that the Dominicans are God's watchdogs. St. Thomas Aquinas is sometimes called the common doctor, not because he was common, but because his teaching should be common to everyone, in the sense that his teaching should be universal. But of course, St. Albert the Great already got the title of universal doctor for a different reason. St. Albert is the universal doctor because he knew about everything. St. Thomas is the universal doctor because everyone should know his teachings. In any case, we call St. Thomas the common doctor, but that's what it means. His teachings should be common to every school, university, and seminary. He was canonized in 1323, and he was declared a doctor of the Church in 1567 by Pope Pius V. Finally, a personal note of some contemporary relevance. St. Thomas went to 2 masses a day, especially when he was presiding at one of them. In other words, if he was presiding, he felt he also needed to just go to Mass. And my experience resonates with that, and I'm no Aquinas, obviously, but back when I used to play with the musicians during the Mass, I always felt like I also needed to attend a different Mass, because I wasn't really fully present and participating when I had to worry about what song was next and what notes to play. So I wonder if that could be a challenge for everyone who serves in Mass in any way. Ask yourself whether you might need to attend a different Mass than the one in which you serve, so that you can receive what God has for you without having to have your mind on the logistics of your service. Just a thought. So what is your entry point if you want to read St. Thomas's writings? Well, there are many ways in, and if you already have the Classics of Western Spirituality book on Albert and Thomas, that has a good introduction, and the excerpts from Thomas's writings focus on prayer and things that seem to be interesting to the average layperson. On the other hand, if you're more interested in philosophy and you want to dive right into some great excerpts from the Summa, the Penguin Classics book called Thomas Aquinas Selected Writings is also a great introduction to his life and thought. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't even need to buy anything because his writings are all online in both Latin and English. But I also want to recommend something by my predecessor as host of this podcast. Mike Aquilina's book, Praying in the Presence of Our Lord with Thomas Aquinas, includes Thomas's hymns and prayers with devotional reading, and it's especially suited to Eucharistic adoration. You will take that little book into prayer with you, and you'll be glad you did. And all of this will be linked in the description. Next time on The Way of the Fathers, we step out of our chronological path for a look at the newest doctor of the Church, St. John Henry Newman. The month of November 2025 will be dedicated to him as our Holy Father proclaims him the 38th Doctor of the Church. Thanks for listening.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.